Well, Mr. Oldham was a friend of John Dryden. He was a man of barely 30 when he died in 1683. John Dryden's elegy, which was written shortly after his death, portrays Oldham as a fellow laborer, a fellow poet, who Dryden says surely would have achieved fame had he lived longer. What's interesting about this poem that I'd like to draw our attention to is not just the meter, but also the classical allusions, at the absence even of Christian allusions. Now, this was written in the late 17th century. Dryden is very conscious of the fact that poetry in the late 17th century needs a new voice, and he's very aware that the old poets of the early 17th century, Edmund Waller, John Donne, George Herbert, all of that was in the past, and that he and his fellow poets were turning to a new kind of poetry, writing a new form. And part of that new form had to do with relying upon classical allusions, and this is called the Neoclassical mode, or the New Classical mode. With the restoration of King Charles II in 1660, poets were now a little bit leery of relying too much upon feeling and religion, and instead wanted to establish a poetry of stability and of order. And part of that stability had to do with going back to the classics. No longer are we going to use biblical or theological language, but let's find a basis in natural classical language. And so that partly is what accounts for Dryden's absence of Christian consolation. Elegies are supposed to move the mind of the speaker and the reader from a place of grief to consolation, and Christian elegy often will have to have recourse to the theological themes of redemption, of the resurrection, of even heaven. This one does not have that. And it's very interesting as a poem of its occasion within the moment of the late 17th century. And this will characterize much of the 18th century as well. Farewell, too little and too lately known. Notice that balance there, too little, too lately. Repetition of two, of course also that alliteration. The neoclassical poets were all about balance. And notice it's not just balanced there within the line, we also have this rhyming couplet. Whom I began to think and call my own. Balance there as well, think and call with those two verbs, but also with this couplet. It's a heroic couplet. Lines of iambic pentameter, that means that each line has 5 stressed syllables, alternating with unstressed, stressed. I have a video meter if you're new to that. So these are iambic pentameter with rhyming couplets called heroic couplets. These heroic couplets are significant because it was John Dryden who began writing in the form of heroic couplets at the end of the 17th century. This was something new when tetrameter was very popular. If you look at Andrew Marvell's To His Coy Mistress, for instance, each line contains 8 syllables, and it's written largely in iambic verse. John Dryden enlarges the octosyllabic line into the 10-syllable iambic pentameter line, and he'll sometimes even extend a triplet we'll see at the end. He found the tetrameters too difficult to turn around in, he said. For sure, our souls, that's the speaker of the poem, and Oldham, our souls were near allied, and thine cast in the same poetic mold with mine. So he's establishing a kinship with the deceased friend. One common note on either lyre did strike, and knaves and fools we both abhorred alike. So they both played on either similar instruments, the lyre, which is where we get the word lyric poem. This is a lyric poem, and the Greeks used to play lyric poetry upon a lyre, a musical instrument, and so it's associated with this poetic composition. So they both played poetry, and they both abhorred, or hated, knaves and fools. To the same goal did both our studies strive. The last set out, the soonest did arrive. Thus Nisus fell upon the slippery place, while his young friend performed and won the race. This figure of Nisus is an obscure neoclassical reference, and this is partly why Samuel Johnson hated neoclassicalism. He said that it was a sort of pedantry based on obscure allusions, and that's one of the obscure allusions here. Nisus, according to the story, was in a foot race. He fell in a pool of blood, and in order to allow his friend to win the race, he tripped the opponent while he was lying there in the blood. So Nisus fell upon the slippery place, while his young friend performed and won the race. So it's almost as if Oldham's fall is allowing Dryden to succeed as the great poet. O early ripe to thy abundant store, what could advancing age have added more? It might, what nature never gives the young, have taught the numbers of thy native tongue. If he had lived longer, perhaps he would have mastered English verse, which is really what John Dryden is trying to do, along with many other poets of this period. But satire needs not those, and wit will shine through the harsh cadence of a rugged line. A noble error, and but seldom made, when poets are by too much force betrayed. You're saying there were some imperfections about Oldham's verse, although it promised good poetry in the future. Thy generous fruits, here again is this metaphor of the fruits. They don't like conceits, the Augustan age poets, Dryden and his contemporaries, but you can see a very delicate conceit or extended metaphor being used throughout here. O early ripe to thy abundant store, what could advancing age have added more? Again, he ripened early. He was an early bloomer. He had generous fruits. He produced much poetry. Though gathered ere their prime, before they were ready, they were gathered, still showed a quickness, and maturing time but mellows what we write to the dull sweets of rhyme. Notice this is what's called a rhyming triplet. Dryden uses them a bit. I mentioned how he felt that 8-syllable lines were too short, not long enough to turn around in. Sometimes even with heroic couplets, Dryden has a hard time of turning around. So he'll sometimes spin an additional line and cause a triplet to be made here, linking these 3 rhymes. But more, hail and farewell, farewell thou young, but too short, Marcellus of our tongue. Again, echoing back to the beginning, too little and too lately known, here too short, Marcellus. Another classical reference, Marcellus was the nephew of Augustus. He was very young. He was below the age of 20 when he became famous for his military exploits, and then he died, I think at the age of 20, very young. And so Dryden is saying this poet is much like that young general of the Augustan age. The Marcellus of our tongue, thy brows with ivy and with laurels bound. You hear the phrase poet laureate, the national poet. It comes from this classical idea that the poets who won the poetry competitions or the victors in races won garlands or wore crowns of laurels and ivy. And here's the conclusive couplet here. Thy brows with ivy and with laurels bound, but fate and gloomy night encompass thee around. So the poet really lamented the death of this poet, of this Marcellus of our tongue, this Mr. Oldham, because he showed forth so many fruits, so many promises of good verse, but in the end he died. And where's the consolation? The poem, as Dryden's contemporaries did note, is pretty much void of Christian consolation. We end with fate and gloomy night encompassing Mr. Oldham around. So it's a very steady poem. It doesn't really take us from one place to another like many elegies will attempt to do. It has, I think, an even keel throughout its tone. It's not really a transit. It's really just a single statement. One more thing to note that I did not mention about this triplet here is that the last line of his triplets are usually a line of hexameter, of 6 stressed syllables. So pentameter is 5 stressed syllables, hexameter is 6, so we've got 12 syllables here in this line. It adds a nice conclusive sense to it, but again shows how Dryden himself was kind of struggling with how to be concise in his language and how to use couplets effectively. It was Alexander Pope, John Dryden's successor poet, really, who perfected the heroic couplet. Something to keep in mind, though, because Dryden gets very close. And if it weren't for Dryden, we wouldn't have Alexander Pope. So that's no discredit to him. I hope you enjoyed this poem. Pretty representative of the Augustan age. It's pretty representative of Dryden, although this is the most personal that Dryden ever gets in his poetry. All the same, it's often anthologized, and you'll probably come across it in your reading of poetry. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.